Hello, everybody. My name is Matt DeLacluse, General Manager for RAECO Rents. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for our webinar on ISO 45001. Are you ready? Our presenter today is Amy Timmerman. In this 45-minute free webinar, she will cover the following: key points of each of the clauses of the standard, identifying major issues related to the requirements, importance and value of implementing the ISO 45001 standard through a health and safety management system. Ask the expert, your questions answered. With more than 19 years of experience in environmental health and safety, Amy Timmerman currently serves as Region 5 Area Director for the American Society of Safety Professionals. She is a certified safety professional and a certified health education specialist. She's been actively involved in the U.S. Technical Advisor Committee for the ISO 45001 Occupational Health and Safety Management System and is an instructor for the ASSP ISO 45001 course. She also serves on the Standards Development Committee and ANSI Z10 Occupational Health and Safety MS Committee. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Northern Iowa and a master's in occupational safety from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. I would now like to welcome Amy as a speaker and thank her for sharing her expertise with our customers. I'd like to turn the microphone over to Amy. Welcome.
Well, great. Well, thank you for that introduction there, Matt. And I just want to welcome everyone to the webinar and thank RAECO Rents for this opportunity to present on the ISO 45001, because I'm very excited about the standard and very passionate on this standard. But before I begin, I just want everyone to know that the slide deck is available and you can go back and reference that material. I'm gonna, due to time constraint, I'm just gonna highlight some of the key concepts as we go through the slides, but you can always reference back after this call for additional information. So I've been involved in the US TAG since 2013 when the standard was brought forward again. And it's been exciting to see the growth of the standard and how it was developed and where it is today. And then I'll also talk a little bit about where the standard is going in regards to a family of 45001 standards. So, oh boy. Oh, here we go. So I just wanted to start out and show you a clip here. This is actually a photograph from one of the international meetings that was held abroad. And this is one of the most significant health and safety standards in the past 50 years. And when I describe the meetings for the international meeting, I can tell you it's almost like negotiating a treaty. You have all these different countries getting together and have all their different viewpoints and trying to come to some type of conclusion and solution moving forward and how we're going to bring this standard all together. And I thought this cartoon was a great example of, you know, our first order of business will be creating standards for the standards group, because when you have all these different countries involved, you know, it was a lot of different opinions coming in all different directions. And then you had, you know, your different pockets of groups. And with this cartoon, I like because you had, you know, as from the US standpoint, you know, we have the ANSI Z10. So, you know, that was kind of our influence moving forward. You had, you know, groups looking to align it to 14,001, looking to align it more with 9,001. Then you had the OSWA 18,001. Then you had the International Labor Organizations. You had all these different groups, you know, coming together and working as a team, putting this standard together. But it was very exciting. But this just kind of gives you an overview. And the International Committee, they met several times within a 4.5-year time frame. It started out between each of this, the first draft to the second draft, they met once or twice. Then between the second and third draft, they was 2 to 3 times. And then between to the final draft, there was like 4 to 5 international meetings. So it kept growing as I got closer to the final development of the standard. So this just gives you an overview of the involvement in the standard. And it was actually close to more than 80 countries that were involved in this standard, and it is the first global occupational health and safety census standard. So just to give you a little background on the development of the standard, the occupational health and safety standard, this was the fourth time that it was brought forward. The previous 3 times it has failed, and it failed for various reasons. And I can tell you, I know the U.S. Voted no to the standard previously too. But this time, as it took off, if you go back to 2013 when it got traction again and was brought forward, there was a couple things going on. And one of the big contributing factors, if you remember, there was a huge tragedy in Bangladesh I think it was a couple hundred people died in an incident back there. And that kind of also helped get the momentum going, because right after that, this was proposed to come forward again. And then as we know how it evolved, that it got approved and moved forward with the standard. The standard was approved last year at this time by the international community in January of 2018. So it got approved by the international committee, but then each country had to also approve the standard. They were going to accept it and acknowledge it in their country. And the US did approve the standard in February of last year, and it came out here in the US on March 12th of 2018. But I'm not sure, I have to go back, I haven't double checked, but not all the countries, when the International Committee voted on it in January, I can tell you like India, they voted no on the standard. But I don't know as a country, I haven't gone back to look to see if India voted to adopt the standard in their country. I suspect they have adopted it just because of just the global consensus of the standard, and as much as a global, businesses are, a lot of businesses do work in India, that they more than likely move forward with adopting it. So where is the standard going? Even though the standard got approved last year, the international community is still meeting on a regular basis. They met in September of 2018, last fall, and they met for a couple of things came out of that meeting. One was they voted on and approved to move forward with like a family of 45,001 standard, just like you see with 9,000 family of standards. And one of them they voted to move forward is you're going to see an ISO 45003, they call it, coming out, and that's going to be on psychological health and safety in the workplace. Now, this will still have to go through the rigorous process that 45,001 did, so you probably won't see this coming out for another maybe 3 years as it goes through the process, but that is another standard that will be coming out of this 45,000 series of standards. They also agreed upon a small and medium-sized handbook for those enterprises. Now, this isn't going to be a standard, so to say, but it will be a handbook, and there's a lot of pressure to get this out by the end of 2019. The good thing of it being as a handbook, it doesn't have to go through a rigor of a process that a standard does to get out. So this is looking to come out in the 2019, and the U.S. has involvement in these subcommittees. So there are people from the U.S. TAG that are sitting and having input into this small and medium-sized enterprise handbook. And then the other thing, you'll notice when I talked about 45,003, why didn't they go 45,002? Well, they decided to put 45,002 is going to be a placeholder, and it's going to be a placeholder for the implementation guide. Just like you have with OSWA 18001, there's an OSWA 18002 that's an implementation guide. So the ISO 45,002 will be an implementation guide. Now that hasn't been voted on. They haven't officially voted on that, but there is a placeholder for that. The International Committee will be meeting again in March of this year, and the exciting thing is actually the U.S. will be hosting the international meeting for the first time. It's going to be in Dallas, Texas. So it'll be interesting to see at that time if they decide to move forward and vote officially on on 45,002 as an implementation guide, but down the road you will see that coming. As far as standards, I just want to talk about, there's been a real rise in standards in the last 10 years, more growth than we've seen, over the past, previous years. And if you take a look at it, they're being used in over 127 countries, and there's over 100,000 certificates issued. And that's a combination of OSHA 18001, the ANSI Z10, and other country-specific certificates to occupational health and safety. So one of the most compelling reasons for the occupational health and safety standard is the data. If you take a look at it, this is actually new data that came out in 2017 by the Workplace Safety and Health Institute. And there's over 2.78 million workers that are fatalities due to work. And that's actually up from 2005. And the interesting part of that is if you look at the 2.78, 2.4 million of those are just linked to work-related diseases. So there's been definitely, an uptick still in the number of fatalities, but a good majority of them are related to the work-related diseases. And if you put that in perspective, you're looking at 7,722 fatalities per day, per a year, or per day per year. So that's a lot of, injuries that are still happening, or fatalities still taking place. So let's just take a look at the general overview of ISO 45001 compared to Z10 and 18001, because there's still, a lot of organizations out there that's, have used Z10 and 18001. Just to put it in perspective here, you can see the different clauses from 45001. And then take a look at how they compare to the Z10 and the 18001. I can tell you I'm on the Z10 committee, Z10 is being revamped, and you're looking at Z10, a new edition coming out this year in 2019. And one thing that Z10 is doing is they're going to be aligning to the ISO 45001. Now, there are going to be differences in each of those sections, but overall the alignment will look very similar to 45001. So you can see in there, one thing I want to point out is, in Z10 and OSHA 18001, you see the management review at the end of the cycle. But when you look at 45001, actually the management review falls under performance evaluation. So it's a little bit different how they do the management review, but I'll point that out when we get to that that section in that clause. So you're going to find in this standard more enhancements than you've ever seen in any other management system. Some of the things I just want to point out here is culture is a big one. This is the first time that you're going to see culture called out as a requirement in a standard. You do not see that in Z10 or OSHA 18001. You might see it in the implementation or in the right-hand text of Z10, but it's not a requirement. So this is the first time you'll see that in the standard. There's also procurement there's a lot involved with procurement, more than what you'll see in Z10 and 18001, and that's in particular to outsourcing, and we'll talk a little bit about that for clause 8. In the, safety professionals, we're dealing more with contractors, but outsourcing is also part of this standard, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. A lot of worker participation in this standard. And then, again, with any management system, is just integrating in the business process. But you're definitely going to see a lot more enhancements than you've seen in any other occupational health and safety management system before. So I just want to talk about a little about the challenges with the development of the standard and some of the requirements to kind of give you a little bit of a background in it. So one of the big challenges was, just the diversity of input. When you have 80 countries involved in developing the standard, everybody, has their different opinions. coming in all different directions. But on the flip side, you can use that diversity, and we did, to help strengthen and make a strong standard, which I believe that the standard is stronger due to all the diversity that was inputted into the standard. There was also talk about whether a basic or mature occupational health and safety management system concepts. Some individuals, countries just wanted to keep a very basic, other ones wanted to have a mature. And I think a lot of that was brought on, different countries have different, maturity levels if you look at it from a management system perspective. So that's where that came through. And the other challenge was the language and translation. So the standard was written in English, but we had to be aware of how it would translate into other languages. So we would, get something set for a certain clause, sentence, and then somebody would bring up, well, that doesn't translate as so in this language. So that would have changed the whole interpretation of that sentence. So that was definitely a challenge, is the language and translation into all these other languages, and making sure that the concept and the interpretation wasn't different in that language. And then there was also could be no should statements. Some of the issues that were related to the requirements were just on the spectrum of management system thinking. Those were kind of all over the board. And, for those of you that are not as much aware of, management or system thinking, a Dr. Russell Ackoff, he has a 9-minute clip called Beyond Continuous Improvement. And if you don't know what system thinking is, he does a really good job of explaining that and doing an analogy using some examples with vehicles and how that works with system thinking. So I'd highly recommend, if you want to learn more about system thinking, is Dr. Russell Ackoff is a good resource for that. Another issue related to the development of standard is just whether the objective of the standard was compliance or conformance. Some countries came and they said, this is just, we want it to be just, compliance standard. And so there was a lot of discussion around that. And probably the biggest discussion overall, though, I'd have to say, is on the small and medium-sized enterprises, because it kept circling back as this standard kept growing over the 4.5 years of development, is going back to, well, how will this relate? How can a small and medium-sized enterprise implement this? And that kept circling back and on what level it would be applicable to those enterprises and organizations. And I think of you that have already kind of looked at the standard, that's kind of why out of the discussion in last fall in the international meeting, they decided to move forward with a small and medium-sized enterprise handbook to help these organizations with the implementation guide. So that was part of coming out of that. And then also just application of the common management system language, which I'll talk a little bit here now on the next slide here. So ISO has now what we call the Annex SL language, and it's language that all ISO standards are going to use going forward. For those of you that are familiar with the 14001 2015 version, you'll see it in there, and also the 9001. And what this is same terminology, same language that you're going to see in all ISO standards going forward. And really the reason behind this Annex SL language is to help harmonize all these management systems together. Because if anybody, I'm sure if you've implemented a management system, it's tough to do. And it's tough to implement a management system different from another management system. So by using this common language and terminology, it's a lot easier to integrate these management systems between, if you're going 9001 to 14001, 45001, you can bring them all together using this same terminology. The Annex SL language, again, that's really focused on the general management system requirements. It doesn't get into each ISO standard, then it can provide additional specific stuff. So for 45001, you'll see in there that there was a lot of different safety languages that was brought in there. But it did present several challenges, this Annex SL language, and one was on terminology. So there were certain terms, and their definitions that had to be used. So one of the workarounds for that is you would see a terminology, for example, risk, but then because that had a Annex SL terminology definition, what the committee would do is, to help better explain it, they would have an OH&S risk, and then they would be able to write a definition for that. So a couple of them, even for objective, you'll see there's an OH&S objective. So that was a way to help get around some of this terminology that was a little bit different than what we see from definitions in the safety profession. You could make changes to this Annex SL language, but it was really difficult. There was times where they wanted to make some changes, but it was such a process, and it was almost like moving a mountain to change this Annex SL language. So none of it got changed, and the committee stuck to what the Annex SL language was, and no additional changes were made. But that did make it challenging. But again, one of the key benefits of this Annex SL language is really just harmonizing the management systems from one system to another. And I am seeing the fruits of that and the benefits, just working with a couple of clients that have 9,000 and 14,001. It does make for a smoother transition over to 45,001 with this Annex SL language. This just gives you a kind of an overview of when I say the Annex SL language. All that blue text is language that was already in the standard when it came out, or when we started working on it in 2013. So everything in blue, all those headings underneath there, was all Annex SL language. All the black wording on here is what was added in from the international community. So if you look at it, 50% of the standard was already complete when we started the process in 2013, and it only took 4.5 years to get the other 50% of it completed. So what's inside the standard? Here's just a quick snapshot overview of it. You'll see the different clauses. I just highlighted the really the meat and potatoes of it, the terms and definitions. You got the context, leadership, planning, support, operations, performance evaluation, improvement. And this is what you'll see, even the same structure for other ISO standards that have the Annex SL language going forward. So what's covered in the standard? So all the requirements in 45,001, okay, that's covered in the management system. But in addition, organizations can choose to include other aspects of health and safety that they want into the standard. But keep in mind, when you do that, you would also be audited to that from an auditor standpoint. I've seen that come back to bite some organizations where they include, additional things, which is great, but also then when they went to audit it, they weren't following these additional things, and then it ended up being like a non-conformance. This standard does not cover product safety. I get that question a lot, but it does not cover product safety. And it's also applicable to all other organizations. And one comment I want to go back to is, for those of you that have the OSHA 18001, OSHA 18001 will be going away in March of 2021. So those of organizations that currently have that certification, they have a 3-year grandfather period to move over to 45,001. After that, they would lose that certification for 18,001 because it's moving over to 45,001. So let's get into each of this clauses, and I want to point out clause 3 definitions. And it's really important that, I can't stress enough, every word in this standard was deliberately chosen. Every word in there not in this standard was deliberately omitted. There was discussion on every word in this standard. But when you look at definitions, it's really important to go through and read the definitions before you get into the standard. And if you're anybody like me, what I'll do is I'll start reading something, and then if I get to a word I don't know what it is, then I go back to the definitions. But for this standard, I would say that would definitely be a mistake. It's really important to look through these definitions because you're thinking of a terminology, even from definition of worker, may not be what's actual definition in the standard. So I can't stress enough to definitely read through these definitions before you get into the standard. And take note that in those definitions, underneath it, and some of them you'll see note 1, note 2. All those notes are part of the definition. And then also, there's in the annex, there's some clarification on a couple of the definitions. So just wanted to point that out. When we get to worker, I'll explain why that's important on that one particular. And then also, the default is the Oxford Dictionary. So if there's a word in there that's not have a definition in clause 3, you want to make sure that you go to the Oxford Dictionary, because that will always be the default for the ISO standards. So on clause 4, this is on context of the organization. And for those of you that have 9,000 or 14,001, you should be very familiar with context of the organization, because this section is very similar. If you line all the 3 standards up, they're all very similar on context of the organization. And this gives an organization the green light, to look outside and look at all your internal and external issues. So you want to look at, legal requirements, financial, technology, internal issues, looking at talent management, do you have a big turnover at your company, is looking at all these issues. And then one example I see with companies when they're looking at their internal and external issues, they use the SWOT method, their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, or they do brainstorming. But I find that tool, when I work with clients, is we use the SWOT when we're identifying all these internal and external issues. So you identify all your internal and external issues, but then also in clause 4, you're going to be identifying all your interested parties. And interested parties can be, who would be your biggest interested party would be your workers. But then you got your insurance, you got your fire department, you got your shareholders. You identify all your interested parties and what are their needs and expectations. And then what you're going to do is define your scope of your management system. So clause 4, you really can combine that with your 14,001, 9,001, or any other management system you have, but it's looking at the bigger picture of the context organization. But this comes back into play when you get to the planning part of the standard, and you have to take a look at, your interested parties and what their needs and expectations when you're doing that planning process. So on clause 5, leadership and worker participation, this one, there was a lot of additional things made. 5.4 on participation and consultation. This is the only standard where you'll see 5.4. It's very unique to the occupational health and safety management system. You won't see this in the other ISO standards, but this is all on worker participation consultation. So some of the things that you might see different in clause 5 is, again, it's top management. They have a big role in this. It can't be passive anymore. It has to be an active role. They have to be responsible for the processes and knowledge of the context of the organization, identifying hazards. And this is the first time or first piece in the standard. There's only 2 times in the standard, but this is where the culture, you'll see this as a requirement. And this is where it talks about top management is responsible for promoting and leading an occupational health and safety culture. Now, there was a lot of debate of having culture in this standard, back and forth. It took several years to come to agreement. I know the US put in a comment that said, we don't want can we put it at the top? If you do all these, then you have a culture. But it ended up being in 5.1, and where you'll see top manager responsible has a list of all these items, and one of them is culture. And then worker participation consultation, that's a big one on 5.4. And when you take a look at that section, it gets really prescriptive of what workers need to be consulted on and what they need to participate in. Previously in the standard, it was sprinkled around in all the different sections. The US put in a comment that said, hey, instead of having this spread out throughout the standard, let's put it under one section so it's all condensed and you have a good overview of what workers need to participate and consult on. So definitely pay attention to 5.4 because it gets a prescriptive on what workers need to participate and consult on. I want to bring up the word worker because they use the word worker now as opposed to employee. If you're familiar with the ANSI Z10, they use the word employee, but in this standard, they use worker. So worker has it's really expanded the broad look at worker. And let me explain a little bit more. So if you look at the definition of worker, it talks about a person performing work or work-related activities under the control of the organization. Now, it used to just say person performing work or work-related activities, but the US did really push hard. They wanted to get the wording under the control of the organization, in addition to some other wording, but not all of it was approved of, but at least it got under the control of the organization. And the reason I highlight that, if you go down into the notes, under note 2, it talks about to the extent of the organization shares control the work or work-related activities. So what does that mean? This is where it's important to go to the annex. So the U.S. put in a comment is what do you mean by shares control or the work or work-related activities? So if you go to the annex, it explains what that definition is, and it says do you provide the means and the methods? So let me give you an example. Let's say you have a plumber that comes into your facility, and you're going to have them, fix a pipe. So you call the plumber, they come in, and you say, "Here's the pipe, fix it." So they fix it. Would they be your worker? No, because you're not providing the means and the methods. Now they may fall under your contractor program if you have a contractor safety program, but they wouldn't fall under the definition of worker. Now, if you had that plumber come in and you tell them to fix the pipe and you tell them, well, I want you to use lead solder when you fix that, well, now you're telling them the means and the methods. So now they just became your worker. So you got to be careful when you're looking at workers on do you provide the means and the methods. And this gets into broader, especially when you're looking at worker participation and consultation, when it talks about workers, well, who's all your workers? So you want to look at the fine lines when you're looking at the definition of worker, but it's the means and the methods. If you're providing the means and methods, then they would fall under the definition of worker. If you're not, they would not fall under worker, but they may be falling under your contractor safety program if you have one of those. Oops. Sorry about that. Is that all right, so what you might expect from a leadership from the policy standpoint. Sorry, I'm having, so it talks about roles and responsibilities and employee engagement, and this is very similar to Z10 and OSWA 18001, is you have to have a policy and you have to have roles and responsibilities. There we go. But what may be different in the policy, it gets prescriptive. So when you're looking at 5.2, make sure you take a look at that section and just go through that you hit all these key points. It talks about, is it appropriate to the organization's risk and opportunities? Do you have a commitment to eliminate hazards and reduce OH&S risks? Commitment to compliance with legal requirements, a commitment to worker participation. Now, you don't have to say them in those such words, but does your policy cover those commitments? Originally, it used to say commitment to hierarchy of controls, but there was a lot of discussion and they changed it to eliminating hazards and reducing risk. So make sure you take a look at your policy and just line it up next to the policy elements in 45,001 and see if you meet those. It also gets really prescriptive in worker engagement. I think I already talked a little bit about that, but in 5.4, you just want to take a look at that section. It tells you, workers need to participate in this, they need to be consulted in this. And that's why when we talk about the definition of worker, you want to make sure you identify, who are those workers. So in clause 6, this was the planning section. As you can see from this, when I show the blue here, there was only a little bit of Annex SL language in this. So there was a lot of work done in the last 4.5 years on the clause 6 on the planning organization or planning. So some of the things that you may see different in the clause 6 is, this is where it goes back to, you need to reference the contextual organization and your requirements. So in clause 4, we were talking about the contextual organization, the internal and external issues, your interested parties. So when you're planning now, you need to make sure that you take into account those interested parties. What's also different is the definition of risk. In the ISO terminology, it was the effect of uncertainty. But then here's where the International Committee made another definition of OH&S risk to define that a little bit more. And then it's also interesting that you have to determine your objectives at all levels to maintain and improve the OH&S management system. So for those of you that develop objectives, I found this very interesting, and I asked an individual on the committee, when I develop objectives, I'm always thinking of objectives as continuous improvement, making it better. But you can have objectives to maintain. And I said, well, what does that mean? Because I'm not used to, I'm always thinking of continuous improvement. So they gave me an example of an objective to maintain is, Amy, it's such a hazard, such a risk that if you took your eyes off of it, it would have catastrophic effects. So you want to have an objective just to maintain. So that's how it was explained to me. Now I do know you have to have at least one objective for improvement. You can't just have an objective to maintain and no improvement objectives. They would be looking for an improvement objective also. But you can have objective to maintain. In clause 7, this is where we get into the support section. And a lot of this is very similar to the other ISO standards. This is where we're talking about what are your resources, your competency. And competency is a little bit different. It used to be, I think they used to call it in Z10, I think they called it in, training. But if you think about it, training that's all an input. Competency is the output. It talks about awareness and communication, and then document information. So as far as documentation, I put this slide together just to give you an overview of how much documentation is required, because this was a big kind of sticking point for several different, countries when they were getting together and talking about all this documentation. You can see on one side is all the requirements. These are Annex SL language requirements. Can't change it. Then in addition, there was other requirements that were put in that you have to document. There was a proposal, and I can't remember what country it was, that there could be an exemption for small, medium-sized enterprises, that they won't have to do all of this documentation, but that never moved forward. But keep in mind, documentation, sometimes we think of it as an necessary evil, but I look at it as data analytics. You document information, you can do a trend analysis and looking at it as a positive and not just a negative. So you do a lot of, and then also, if you have a changeover, you're not reinventing the wheel, you have a history of what's been done. So I like to look at it as a positive. And I always recommend with the small and medium-sized enterprises when I'm working with them, I'm like, don't get overwhelmed by it. It doesn't have to be 15 pages of documentation. We can just do a one-pager here to document it. So it doesn't have to be lots of pages. So just keep in mind all the different documentation requirements. So so clause 8 is operation, and this is kind of the heart of the management system. This is where a lot of, as safety professionals, we live in, in the operations side of it. And you can see here that a lot of this was developed on the international committee. Not much of this was Annex SL language, except outsourcing is. I should have highlighted that in blue. So in clause 8, what you're going to see a little bit different here is, okay, so now you did all this planning in clause 6. So now you're going to implement all your actions in clause 8. But then also you need to be able to control the processes, establishing the criteria. And this is a little bit different. What's your criteria, for example, that your planning process is working? What's your criteria that your monitoring measurement is working? What are your key performance indicators? So just like it's looking at it from a quality standpoint is, how do you know that your process is working? So a little bit different thinking here is taking a look at what is your criteria to know that your processes are working? What is your criteria that you know your management of change process is working, or your chemical approval process is working? What's that criteria? So a little bit different thinking here. It's also talking about, controlling the risk for your interested parties in the workplace. And then outsourcing. So the control of the outsourcing process and in the procurement section. So to give you just a little background on outsourcing, so in the standard you have procurement, and then underneath that you have contractors and outsourcing. There was a lot of discussion on procurement. Nobody really knew what to do with procurement, because in the safety professionals, we're dealing with contractors most of the time, not much with procurement and outsourcing. And this procurement actually was decided on after 4.5 years. It was the last 2 hours of the last day the committee was together before any kind of consensus was established with procurement, just to kind of give you an idea of how it has evolved over the last 4.5 years. But there were so many different thoughts on what procurement was, how to implement it in the occupational health and safety management system. But the key thing here is it's a short, there's 2 sentences in this section, but the key is that last sentence where it talks about the type and the degree of control is up to you. So for procurement, the definition is, look at it as what's a function or a process of your organization. So like your IT is a function, and maybe you outsource that. Maybe you outsource your payroll. Maybe there's a process that you outsource. You have a product you're making, but then you're going to outsource the sewing. So you outsource the sewing, and then it comes back to your plant, and then you package it up and ship it out. Well, people were saying, I outsource stuff because I don't have the expertise to do it in-house. That's why I'm sending it out, because I don't have the expertise. But the committee was also, there was discussion about it. Well, we don't want you just to be outsourcing all your high hazard stuff and then you kind of just, shake it off and say, let them deal with it. There was some level of responsibility. Again, there was a lot of discussion around this. What came down to is if you have a function or process and you're outsourcing it, the type and degree of control is up to you. Now, you don't want to get into a liability issue where you're managing somebody else's company safety. I mean, there was, people brought that up, but you could be as simple as, let's say you're outsourcing, you're doing some dipping and coating, and you're outsourcing that. Something in the contract that says, you need to abide by all, OSHA regulations for dipping and coating, and keep it as simple as that is in the contract. That's what my recommendation is, just putting something in that contract. Now, how this evolves, it'll be, it's still to see how this is looked at from an auditor perspective. There's still a lot of question on outsourcing and how it'll be audited from the 45,001 standpoint. But that's the best advice I can give you is keeping it simple. And remember, the type and degree of control is up to you. but you don't want to get into liability where you're telling a company how to do the means and the methods. You want to take that out of it. As far as Clause 9 on performance evaluation, most of this was Annex SL language. There were a couple additions made, but a lot of the additions that were made to this section are exactly what you'll see in 9001 and 14001. So these are a couple of things that you might see different in this clause. One I thought was interesting is just use of the calibrated and verifying equipment, compliance with requirements and corrective actions. One thing also with the management review, it gets very prescriptive on the inputs and outputs. So you want to make sure you take a look at the management review of the inputs and outputs for the management of review. What were the other ones? And then this was also the results of the management review also need to report it to relevant interested parties. So you need to go back to the list of your interested parties you identified and see if any of those individuals, based on the results, need to have that information reported back to them. So that's one unique one. Yeah. As far as Clause 10 goes, this is on improvement. And one thing I want to point out with improvement here is when you look at the definition of incident, includes near misses. So there was kind of I want to say just not an uproar, but when you look at it and you're looking at the incidents, people are like, oh my, you got to evaluate every incident. And then with the word near miss in there, they're like, okay, so every coffee spill, I have to do this, this, and this, and this. So I think people got into the weeds too much with the near miss, but it is part of incidents. But just keep that in mind that incidents is part of the definition of incidents. So some of the things that you might see different, I found it just an odd placement for corrective action of a nonconformity or incident, because to me, is it really an improvement? So it's kind of almost like a brain twister. You got to look at it as a positive here. Talked about incidents being part of near misses. And then again, establishing continuous improvement process rather than just part of the planning processes. So it's two different things. But the good thing about Clause 10 is if you have other ISO standards, this clause is very familiar from one to the other. So what you have in Clause 10 for improvement, you really could, it would be a smooth transition over to 45,001. And this is also the second part of the standard where you'll see promoting an occupational health and safety or culture. So two places in the standard you're going to see culture. One is in 5.1 top management responsibility, and then here in Clause 10 on promoting an occupational health and safety culture. So I just kind of wanted to help give you, a roadmap of what you can do now. Is for those of you that aren't as familiar with management system, is just start to get management system savvy. Because I really believe it's the future. So if you're at an organization that already has 9001 or 14001, connect with those individuals that are involved in that, and see what they're doing, because you can use that resource as you move forward, with either 45,001 or any other management system. I also, recommend too, there's additional courses out there. ASSP offers an ISO 45001 course. I think they do a really good job. They have an online course, and they also have a face-to-face 3-day course. There's a lot of resources available too on the ASSP website for 45,001, so you can reference back to there. For those of you that don't have the standards, you can just Google Annex SL language. And when you do that, that'll give you all that Annex SL language, which is 50% of the standard. So you can use that as a starting point also, because that's all the wording that is used in 45,001. I just talked about meeting with other individuals in your organization, and then also just picking up the standard in Z10 or 45,001. And the reason I bring up Z10 is when they come out with their new version this year, they're putting together a really nice implementation guide, and that is also going to be very useful for those individuals moving forward with 45,001. And the other thing is they're at free of charge, they're going to have a small and medium size guidance implementation that is going to fit really nicely with those small and medium-sized implementations, and that's going to be offered free of charge. And actually, it's a good guidance document. I've seen it, I've read through it. I think it's even great for large organizations. So that's another free resource, is that small and medium-sized enterprise that's coming out with Z10. So I just want to wrap up with some final thoughts. Is, one, what keeps me up at night is, boy, there's one standard, one way of doing things. Also, concerned always about the confusing requirements of the standard and the interpretation, that people may interpret the standard differently and go down a different path. And then also non-intended outputs, the occupational health management system, including any misuse. But what keeps me up in the morning, again, it's exciting. One standard, one way. We have a global census standard now. So this is really exciting times in the safety professionals. We have one team working on a common goal now. We have a path. We've set the bar now, and again, we'll continue to set the bar as they look at 45,001 in the next 5 years and ramp it up, but moving that path and moving that needle. And then also, just creating a demand for occupational health and safety. I've seen more chatter than I expected on this standard at this point when it came out in March. So it's really exciting times to see the demand for occupational health and safety increasing. And just some closing thoughts. I really truly believe that the future is going to be tied to system thinking. And again, if you're not familiar with system thinking, I really recommend, looking at system thinking, getting educated about it, looking at Dr. Russell Ackoff. He does a great job explaining system thinking. And then also just, managing safety the same way we do other business functions is integrating into the business and connecting it with all other pieces of the organization. And then ultimately, it's all about market presence, driving improvements for occupational health and safety. So I also provided in the slide deck just some references, so you could easily reference some information on 45,001. Some of this is all some free information here. And then I just want to thank everyone for your time this afternoon. I know we have busy things going on. I think we're almost at 2 o'clock, but I still want to, Matt, if it's okay, just open it up for questions.
Yeah, I've got a handful of questions that have come in. So thank you, Amy, for the presentation. Let's go through a couple of these. You said the vast majority of worker deaths are from illness. Evaluating and controlling occupational exposures is the realm of industrial hygiene. Where in the standard is that addressed?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a couple places in there. Is when you're in is it clause 6 in planning, it doesn't call it out, but when you're identifying your risk, your occupational health, your industrial hygiene would fall in all those specific risks when you're identifying them. I can tell you, just going to switch gears, for the ANSI Z10 that's coming out here in 2019, that was a huge focus on Z10 as the occupational health industrial hygiene. You're going to see that loud and clear in the Z10. And one of the reasons, part of that is it's in 45,001, but not as strong as we like to see it. So when the international committee's getting together, the US default is always the Z10. And a lot of these countries look at, it was amazing when I went to these international meetings, is how many countries had the ANSI Z10 standards, with them. So we're looking at using Z10 now that we're putting a little bit more of OC health, is to next time around to strengthen that in 45,001. But to answer your question, you would see that more in the clause 6 under planning and identifying those risks and assessing those. That was where I would include it.
All right. The next question is adopting this standard or any standard a requirement? What are the benefits for a small contractor company to take time to adopt and implement this standard?
Yeah, it's not a requirement. This is a voluntary, standard. So it's definitely not a requirement. Where I do see this could be becoming a requirement is in settlements. I've seen this before where you're in your informal settlement or your abatement is that you're one of the things is you're going to implement Z10, or they may say, OSHA may say in your settlement that you got to implement a management system, and they might say 45,001 or Z10. I've seen that before. But it's not a requirement, it's voluntary. But it's a tool. It'll help you bring all your process together and manage your system as a whole and integrating into the business.
Okay. Next one. If we have ISO 45001, do we need Z10?
Good question. No, I mean either one is fine. So you don't need to have both. I would just look at it from your organization, where I see more people leaning towards the 45,001. If you're a more big global company, organizations are more looking at 45,001 just from a global standpoint. Their customers are asking, or their suppliers are asking, are you 45,001? So that's where I see 45,000 more with the larger organizations. For some of the smaller, medium-sized companies, if they're not as global, I see them more implementing the Z10. I think Z10 is a lot more user-friendly than 45,001. If you pick up Z10, to me, it's a lot more easier with implementation, reading it, straight language. You don't have to read too much in between the lines than you do with 45,001. But one thing with Z10 is in 2019, again, it is going to be aligning more to the 45,001, but it's going to have new concepts in it that the US was not able to get in this round with 45,001. Like they're talking about new view. You'll see that in Z10 now. FSI, occupational health is a big one that you'll see in Z10 now coming out in the new version. And again, they're going to use that, hopefully, they're going to use that as leverage, for the next version of 45,001. But either one is standard. You just got to look at, what's best for your organization.
Where can a copy of the OH&S 45,001 be obtained?
Oh, good question. You know what? You can get that through the American Society of Safety Professionals. You can also get it from the ISO standards, but it's cheaper if you actually, it's cheaper if you go through American Society of Safety Professionals. You're going to pay a little more if you get it through the ISO International Standard Organization. So definitely take a look at the American Society of Safety Professionals. It's cheaper if you go through there.
Is there any plan to provide a list of hazards?
I think in the standard, if you go to the annex, let me check, I have it right here. I should know this one. No, it doesn't list it. No, there's not a list of hazards. I mean, this is something, when you do your hazard identification, you might not just have one process. You could have several processes. We're identifying hazards in our job hazard analysis. You're identifying hazards in your accident investigations. You're identifying hazards in your inspections. So there's a lot of different processes that can filter into how you're identifying your hazards. When you do management of change, you're looking at a new piece of equipment, coming in, you're identifying your hazards. So there's a lot of different inputs into your list of hazards, but there's no specific list out there. But I'm also seeing you can lump them together too, like electrical hazards, chemical hazards. Yeah.
Last question I have. Does ISO 45001 include consideration for management of personal health information? Example, medical surveillance, biological monitoring data?
Yeah, let me think about that one. Not that I can think of. That would be more with your industrial hygiene. I think you get into a little bit of that under is it, clause 9, performance. Is it, yeah, in clause 9, in performance evaluation, you would get into a little bit of the monitoring measurement with industrial hygiene, but nothing is specifically spelled out for that.
Okay, Amy, thank you once again for the presentation. If anyone has any specific application questions, please feel free to call me at 866-RENT-EHS or 866-736-8347. You can also reach me by my email at matt@raecorents.com. If you want to know any more about the technologies we supply, please follow us on social media. Put out lots of good technical tips on their blog at blog.raecorents.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. We do record all these training sessions, and you'll find them out on YouTube, and we'll send out a link later. If there are some topics you'd like us to cover in our webinars, please send me an email with the subject. We have access to lots of product and process specialists. Please let me know what we should cover by emailing me at matt@raecorents.com. At this point, if there are no further questions, our presentation will conclude. Thank you all for attending. All right. Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you.